on mute and stop video until I actually hear myself being introduced.
Okay.
On mute and stop video until I actually.
All right, we are now streaming, and I see as well that many more people are coming into the chat or into our webinar. And I want to thank everyone so much for attending this morning to hear from Eric Ward on the issue of anti-Semitism and white nationalism. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We actually had over 200 people register, and it looks like we're getting close to that with our attendees right now. A couple of notes. Well, first, I'm Rabbi Ricky Camel, the Associate Rabbi at Congregation Eitz Chaim. And I know on behalf of Rabbi Koznowski and myself, our Senior Rabbi, Rabbi Koznowski, to thank everybody for joining us, whether you're coming from Congregation Eitz Chaim, another synagogue in the area, another religious institution in the area, or wherever it is that you're coming from. Thank you so much for attending this morning. If you have a question, the way that this will go is we'll have an hour hearing from our speaker and then about a half an hour for questions. If you have a question, since we are in the webinar format, all you have to do is write in the chat to all panelists your question. They will be collected by a wonderful Mrs. Ellen Simpson, who will then, when we get to the question format, ask those questions. If it's at the end of the time and you haven't gotten your question answered, you are also more than welcome to email them to me. I will put my email as well into the chat, and we can see if we can get them answered even after that. But it is my pleasure as well now to invite up a member of our Social Action Committee, Karen Friedman, to do our introduction for our speaker this morning.
Thank you, Rabbi Camel. Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see such a large group focused on what I think is a really important and timely conversation. I'm really happy to be able to introduce our speaker, Eric Ward. He is currently the executive director of the Western States Center, which is an organization that's dedicated to strengthening inclusive democracy. Mr. Ward has a 30-year history of community organizing focused on issues of inclusiveness and combating racism and hate groups of multiple stripes. He is also a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center. He's also, as I found on the Western States website, a singer-songwriter under the name Bulldog Shadow. So if we run out of questions, which I actually think is unlikely, we can ask him to sing, or Eric, please feel free to burst into song at any moment during your presentation that feels appropriate. I've asked Ellen Simpson to put on the chat room the web address of the Western States Center so that any of you who wish to gather more information about either Mr. Ward or the center itself can do so. Please note there's also a donate button on the website. By the way, Mr. Ward is also a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center at the moment. And just to reiterate what Rabbi said, for those of you who may have come in late, if you have questions that you'd like addressed in after our talk, please put them into the chat room and Ellen will be monitoring those questions. Rabbi Camel and Mary Hasten and I had the great privilege of hearing Mr. Ward speak about a year and a half ago at the RAC's Consultation on Conscience in Washington, D.C. This was back in the days when we could gather and shake hands and talk in person, if we all remember those days. Mr. Ward spoke very compellingly about the relationship between anti-Semitism and white nationalism, and walked us through the historical and ideological confluence of those movements, particularly focusing on the effects of the 1960s and 70s civil rights movement and how white supremacy and white nationalism actually grew out of that in the context of anti-Semitism. Mary and I were so intrigued by his message that, just like a couple of groupies, we interrupted his dinner that night to pursue the conversation. Hopefully he's forgiven us, or at least forgotten about it. There's a meme going around the internet right now that says, a Black man and a Jewish man walked into a bar. The bartender said, "Good evening, senators." Now, aside from the current political implications of that Georgia vote, this meme speaks to the common denominator between Jews and Black Americans, that of the history of hatred and persecution. Juxtaposed with the unfortunate events at the Capitol last week, especially the horrifying photograph of the man wearing a sweatshirt emblazoned with the words "Camp Auschwitz, Work Brings Freedom," the equally disturbing t-shirts with the acronym 6MWE, which stands for 6 million wasn't enough, the multiple images of Confederate flags, and the absolutely soul-chilling image of the gallows and noose erected in front of the Capitol. I think we're all a little bit numb. The less publicized images of ultra-Orthodox Jews participating in this riot were also thought-provoking, for lack of a better word. It's been a disturbing and confusing beginning to 2021. In one of his writings, Mr. Ward said, "The fact that many of us have long recognized that the country we live in is not the one we are told exists doesn't mean we always understand the one that does." That seems, in the current environment, sadly true, and I know that I am confused about the country in which we live. I hope he will enlighten us on that topic. I'm sure his talk will be quite timely today. And with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to our speaker, Eric Ward. Thank you, Eric, for being here.
Thank you so much for that kind welcome. And I indeed do remember when you wonderfully approached us at dinner. And I remember we had a great conversation, but I remember that we all started laughing immediately, showing that at least everyone had good senses of humor, and at least I knew how to fake a good sense of humor. It was really such a joy. And I'm excited to be here today with you all on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday weekend. It is almost a time of great coincidence. And as I speak to you today, I think I speak more of correlating events rather than causation. Where there is causation amongst historical points, I will make that point. But in this moment we find ourselves in, before I head into this story, I want people to think of it as a perfect storm, a number of variables that came into place at a certain time that created another path that was hard to understand. And not only hard to understand, but hard to believe at times. If I were telling you this same lecture 5 years ago, half the audience likely would accuse me of hyperbole. But since I've started talking to folks, a number of events have happened. Charlottesville, the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue, the attacks in El Paso, the attacks in Charleston, South Carolina, Christchurch, New Zealand, the events in DC, 4 years of right-wing incursions here in the West, where Western State Center is headquartered in Portland, Oregon. It's much easier now to understand the different currents that affect American democracy and affect human and civil rights in the United States. But I want to untwine them a little bit. And to do so, I want to walk us through the history of white nationalism. I want to walk us through social movement theory. I want to talk about anti-Semitism and the role that it plays, and the threat that democracy faces in this moment. But it's not just a sad tale. It's also a tale of hope and accomplishment, resiliency, and great sacrifice. There are paths forward that do not lead further into the storm, but pass outward. But that is dependent on the choice points that we make. My story starts back in the 1980s in Long Beach, California. I moved to Long Beach, California in the late 70s. I think I said early 80s. In the late 70s, at a time when Long Beach, California was just engaging in the desegregation of its school districts. I was sent to a school that was about an hour away from where I lived. And busing and desegregation in the Long Beach Unified School District meant for me being given a school pass to take the city bus to my junior high school. I was a young kid in 7th grade. And once I got off the bus, I would still have to walk about another 5 or 6 blocks to my school. That walk each and every week was filled with individuals who drove by, shouting things like, "Go back to Africa," calling me an ape. I'd like to tell you that these were other young people, but these were actual adults, probably on their way to and from work. They didn't care that I was a young kid, just simply trying to make my way through the world. They were so filled with rage that I could be walking through their neighborhood that they couldn't help themselves but to act on it. I often think about how much energy it must have taken in the early mornings to roll down your windows and to scream at someone who was 12 years old, who was simply walking to and from school. I think about all of that energy that gets put into reinforcing racism and how many people are willing to tap and to utilize that much energy. It told me a lot about how race functioned in America. That was my experience for 3 years. I wasn't alone. It happened to other students of color as well, 12, 13, 14 years old. It happened so much to us that it quickly became normalized. I never once thought about telling my parents. I never once thought about sharing this information with a teacher or an administrator. It was just something that happened. It's for us what it meant to go to school each and every day. That was my experience until nearly the end of 9th grade, when one day I and a few other friends were waiting for the bus. And a group of what I think were probably college students drove by in a pickup truck, shouting out some of these racial abuse. I remember one of my friends picking up a rock and throwing it at the truck. And I remember the screeching of the brakes on the truck. I remember the brake lights, and I remember these college students piling out of the truck. I remember at that moment, as some of my friends started to run, that I wasn't going to run anymore. It wasn't that I wasn't afraid, but it was that I knew that I was just tired of running. And so I was going to stand my ground. Now, I have to tell you what happened. I think you all can probably imagine what happened that day. But it is the day that I decided that running away did not solve the horrors before us. That sometimes we have to stand our ground, even when it isn't easy, even when it is uncomfortable, and even when it's painful. Standing our ground in this moment is what we are called to do. We, in the present time, face a number of horrors as well that evoke the same feelings of dread and fear and anxiety that I faced as a 9th grader. We have COVID-19, a global pandemic that has raged across the United States, not simply because of the power of the virus, but because an inability of this current administration in the White House to function, and because of deep racism and other forms of bigotry, ageism to name one. Currently in the United States, nearly as many people have died as COVID as the entire population of Oakland, California. And when you pick under the layers of those deaths, it becomes more disturbing. Currently in the United States, 1 out of every 750 African Americans and 1 out of every 750 indigenous people has died from COVID-19 in the last 11 months. This number bears repeating because our brains can block out sometimes what we're actually hearing. So I'll say it again. In the last 11 months, 1 out of 750 Black people and 1 out of every 750 indigenous people has now died from COVID-19. It's not just the virus killing them. It is the systems of racism and inequality that put these communities at risk. On top of the pandemic, there is global and national economic instability. While unemployment rolls show an unemployment rate of around 17 to 20 million Americans, the truth is that there are likely in excess of over 34 million unemployed Americans in the United States right now. Many unemployed through the course of COVID-19, unemployed because it's not safe to go to work, unemployed because they have been laid off, unemployed because their businesses have shut down. While we may not yet be feeling the repercussions of that economic instability, many working families feel it each and every day. But it's not just pandemic. It's not just economic instability. It is the rise of political violence. The political violence that we saw that led to an insurrection, an attempt to overthrow US democracy on Wednesday, January 6th in Washington, D.C. 5, if not, I believe at least 5 people were killed. I think the new numbers are 6 individuals who were killed, including a law enforcement officer who was killed and murdered when someone decided to crush his head in with a fire extinguisher. We know that that political violence led to an attempted bombings that day, where at least 4 pipe bombs were placed at the Republican National Convention committee offices and the Democratic committee offices. We know in the midst of this insurrection that some individuals sought to kidnap and hold hostage Congress members, including Nancy Pelosi and other women congresswomen like Pramila Jayapal and Representative Presley and others. And it wasn't just those who stormed the Capitol. As media has been reporting nearly every day with new information, it is fairly clear that there were both civil servants, including law enforcement, and elected officials, including congressional representatives, who played a role in helping this insurrection happen. Congresswoman Presley reports that on the day of the insurrection and the breach of Congress, they discovered that the panic button in her office had been removed. To date, no one has provided an explanation on when and how the panic button was removed or why it was removed. We yet have come to understand the full scope of what occurred in Wednesday, January 6th. But we can understand the dynamics that got us to this point. To understand those dynamics, we first have to let go of our own myths. when I talk about myths and stereotypes, I just don't talk about racial myths and stereotypes, the racial slurs and misunderstandings and intentional forms of stereotypes or anti-Semitic tropes, tropes against immigrants, against Muslims that play out each and every day. I talk about the subtle myths that sometimes even we in the human and civil rights field create for ourselves, our own false conventional wisdoms about how the world works and how we understand it, often based in our own feelings rather than experience and knowledge. I liken it to when I finally left Long Beach and moved up to Eugene, Oregon in 1986. I remember when my friends first asked me if I wanted to move up to Eugene, Oregon with them. Two of them were going to school and they were going to attend the University of Oregon. I had grown up in Los Angeles all of my life. I had only really ever left Southern California twice. The first was to go to Modesto in Central California. And the other was when I joined the Navy and went to boot camp in Great Lakes. Now, I remember when my friends were asking me, do you want to come up to move up and leave Los Angeles and come up to Oregon with us? I remember looking them in the eyes with the love that a friend has for another and saying to them, hell no. In my head, I thought, why would I ever leave Southern California, the place I had grown up all of my life, a place that had a vibrant music community that I was a part of, a place where my parents lived? Why would I ever leave? Even though I didn't want to leave, I was smart enough to realize the reality of what was happening in Southern California at that time. A recently launched war on drugs, which we all know now, according to tapes that came out of the White House, that it was a war on Black people. The ravages of the spread of drugs in Southern California led to an evolution of street gangs, making them much more volatile and violent. Southern California was in the midst of an economic recession. Finding a way forward economically as a young kid of color who had grown up poor and working poor, there were just very few choices. So ultimately, I remember finally telling my friends that I would move up to Eugene, Oregon with them. But I want to go back to that moment when they asked me, the first time they asked me if I'd move to Eugene. When they first asked me, if you could have looked in my brain, what you would have seen visually, what was going on in my head was I visualized San Francisco, a lot of trees, and the Space Needle, which wasn't even in Oregon, but in Seattle, Washington. I simply had no idea of what Oregon looked like. And because I had no idea of what Oregon looked like, I began to make up my own mind, fill in the blanks with stereotypes and myths of things I thought Oregon might look like. I had never met anyone from Oregon. I had never been to Oregon. I had never really learned anything about Oregon except for maybe the Lewis and Clark expedition. I simply didn't know anything about Oregon. And so my version of Oregon in my brain looked something akin to Little House on the Prairie, right, in the 1800s, than it did Oregon in 1986. I can remember embarrassingly now asking my friends, did Oregon have running water? Did it have electricity? Did it have McDonald's? Was there cable? I thought Oregon looked like something that looked like horse and buggies, right? Borrowing from other myths and stereotypes that we are aware of. Now, it's true that there were rural parts of Oregon, but that's not where the majority of the population lived. And even those rural places had McDonald's and running water and electricity. Because I had no experience, as I said, I filled in all of these blanks. Now, luckily for me, I had enough trust in my friends and I was courageous enough to make that leap and move to Eugene, Oregon. And it changed my life for the better. And I honestly reflect that it likely saved my life. I grew up in an LA amongst groups of friends where we were convinced that we would never see our 25th birthday. Coming to Eugene, Oregon opened up a lot of opportunities. But imagine for a second that I had said I would move up to Eugene, Oregon, and did so, and then finally got there, and then called home. And maybe my mom would have said, "What's Eugene like?" And instead of reflecting what it actually looked like, I fell back on my stereotypes. Well, that's what we do with the white nationalist movement in America each and every day. Those, the general public, the media, elected officials, and we in the civil rights movement in this country. We fall back on stereotypes and myths, even though we know that they are not seated in reality. It is these myths and realities that these myths that prevent us from building strategies to address what happened in DC. Indeed, it has been our stubbornness and our arrogance over the last 3 decades that also played a role in what occurred in Washington, D.C. last Wednesday. You see, for 3 decades, we have rolled our eyes at the idea that there could be other social movements on the terrain of America. In our arrogance, we saw these social movements as merely an extension of the systemic discrimination that we face in our society. Those who warned us about the rise of these social movements, we rolled our eyes at. We accused them of sensationalism. We told them it wasn't the real issue. And slowly, another social movement built on the horizon. What are some of these stereotypes? Well, the stereotypes are this. We think of this white nationalist movement, this alt-right coalition, is made up of individuals who are uneducated, who don't make very much money, and are just angry because the economics of their lives are so tough. We argue that these individuals are merely unintelligent and aren't informed. And if we just sat and talked to them rationally, they would understand. We often say to ourselves that we must be patient with these social movements as they learn, despite the fact that people of color and Jews are threatened by these groups each and every day. Often, we are more willing to give more tolerance and acceptability to those who terrorize in our society than those who actually face the terrorization. These are the myths and stereotypes. But the fact is that this social movement, which I'll dive into a little bit more deeply next, isn't a movement that is driven by folks who are uneducated or don't make money. Professor James Aho, a professor of sociology at the University of Idaho, wrote one of the most comprehensive overviews of the white nationalist movement. And in his study in the early 90s, James Aho discovered some very fascinating points of fact, not conjecture, not myth. In his study of the white nationalist movement in Idaho, he found that the white nationalist movement in Idaho was made up of individuals who had a higher level of education than the general population of Idaho as a whole. He also found that white nationalist movement had a higher level of income than the general public of Idaho. The third is that they were more politically involved, more politically active. He actually showed that many of the stereotypes we have of the white nationalist driving around in a pickup truck, drinking a Budweiser, right, with the shotgun rack in the back, isn't an accurate description. But we cling to it anyway because it's become part of our conventional wisdom. What is this white nationalist movement? What we know is that it models many other political and religious and ethnic extremist movements that we see in other places in the country. If there are more working class and working poor people in it, if there are more people who didn't go to college or graduate from high school in it, that is simply because that is the predominant makeup of demographics in the United States. There are more working people in the United States, so of course, there would be more working people in these white nationalist formations. But what he found is that these movements, just like extremist movements outside the US, are disproportionately made up of middle and upper middle class people, folks with education. Indeed, when you look at the leadership of the white nationalist movement, you often find that these are individuals who have access to networks and to wealth. They're not being driven by economy. This isn't a conversation on economy and economic inequality that is being debated in our nation. It is a question of governance. Who is an American and who gets to be an American and what will America look like? And it is a debate that is raging on the grounds of civil rights, national identity, and belonging. How did we get here? Well, let me start. The genesis of the white nationalist movement starts in the 1960s. You all may be familiar with something called the 1960 Civil Rights Movement. To understand the 1960 Civil Rights Movement, we have to understand what it was organizing against. It was organizing against something called white supremacy. Now, up until now, you've heard me use the word white nationalism to describe the core of what was functioning in Washington, D.C. and in Charlottesville. That's because I distinguish between the concept of white supremacy, a system, and white nationalism, a social movement. Let me explain. White supremacy is a system of discrimination and exploitation that pre-exists the United States of America. It has been in the United States since 1492. White supremacy was built off the premise that white people were superior based off the color of their skin. It turned the idea of skin color into a biological definition of race. It created a binary, white people superior on one end of the spectrum, and Black people the most inferior on the other end of the spectrum. This idea of white superiority allowed the United States to organize its society. It did so through three primary pillars. The first was the genocide and stolen lives of Native peoples. The second was a system of chattel slavery, a generational enforced slavery of Black people that stripped them of their language, of their culture, and of their background. It forced different ethnic groups and religious groupings out of the continent of Africa and forced them into a new belonging, one that denied them even the idea of having souls. They were considered no different than cattle in the fields. It was those two systems, the stolen resources, the chattel slavery, that drove much of America's formation. But there's a third. And the third that we often don't talk about is the control of women and sexuality in society, misogyny. It was these three pillars that have allowed the United States to be the powerhouse economic society that it is right now. But it came at a brutal cost, the deaths of millions of people. the stilling of hopes and dreams, and it set us on the path that we are on today. White supremacy was the system, and it was uncontested and unchallenged. Even when it was briefly interrupted in the post-Civil War period through Reconstruction, it only happened through military martial law. And as soon as that military martial law was removed, white supremacy began to raise its head under the guise of separate but equal, Jim Crow, separation. That is where the civil rights movement found itself in the 1960s. You all may be familiar with this civil rights movement. It's where a woman by the name of Rosa Parks, as the story is told, or as I learned it in school, one day was tired. And on that one day, this Black woman just happened to be tired in the United States of America under Jim Crow. She decided not to give up on her seat. And on that one day that she just happened to be tired and didn't give up her seat, she was arrested. And lo and behold, the next day, the entire Black community in Montgomery, Alabama, just all of a sudden knew to stay off the buses. And they stayed off the Montgomery buses for a year. And they just knew to give each other rides to work. And then after a year, we're told the Montgomery Bus Association decided that segregation indeed was just bad and that it should be ended. And so they ended it, and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, that's the story we're told. But we all know that that's not the story that occurred. Rosa Parks was a long-time civil rights leader in her community. She was a highly respected figure, an elder in her community. Rosa Parks had been the secretary of the local NAACP chapter. Rosa Parks and other civil rights leaders had gathered months before to strategize on how to challenge white supremacy. They gathered in a place called the Highlander Center on Research and Education outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. They organized, they strategized, and they came back to Montgomery to implement that strategy. For them, it was about dealing with segregation, understanding that the laws that kept segregation in place held together white supremacy nationally and Jim Crow in the South. Rosa Parks was not the first person to be arrested. Many men and women were sat down before her. What they knew is that if they kept doing it, that the community would eventually have enough. And when Rosa Parks was arrested, the community indeed had enough. The myths that were taught about the civil rights movement often also interfere with our understanding. We believe that somehow the civil rights movement of the 1960s functioned for about 15 years, and then everything was fine, that it had overdone hundreds of years of white supremacy. That's impossible. We're also taught that everyone simply changed their minds after the victories of the civil rights movement. Also not true. We're taught that Martin Luther King Jr. was much beloved and respected in the United States. Also not true. The truth is that the civil rights movement was a bloody time in America, and the cost was very high. What we also know is that the civil rights movement, like all social movements, don't have hard beginnings and hard ends. That story I told you about Rosa Parks and the 1960 civil rights movement actually happens in the mid-1950s. In fact, most of the significant civil rights victories that take place in this country take place in the mid-1950s. If you talk to historians, they'll tell you that this 1960 civil rights movement actually starts in the 1930s and 40s. It is only in the 1960s, and particularly in the late 1960s, that it comes to the consciousness of the American public. So too was it with this white nationalist movement. And I'm going to get there in a second. But I want to keep going with the civil rights movement, because I believe understanding how our own social movements function may give us an idea of how other social movements function. Social movements that are grounded in exclusion rather than the inclusionary natures of social movements for justice. So we have this civil rights movement, and it does something quite significant. It's victorious. We're all familiar with the relationship in the civil rights movement between African Americans and a disproportionate number of young Jewish leaders and clergy. Now, I don't want to overplay that relationship. That relationship was very specific and to a specific time and place. For in fact, the relationship in the North amongst Jewish communities and the Black community were not as aligned. There wasn't a set understanding of problems and solutions. Indeed, the relationship between Blacks and Jews in the North and the Midwest was actually much more tense. But the relationship in the South around civil rights, there was an alignment. And it was an alignment, right, of individual Jews who were driven largely by a call for freedom and their own interest. And there's nothing wrong with having your own interest in a national struggle. I want to talk a little bit about that. We may be familiar with the Civil Rights Act, and we may be familiar with the Voting Rights Act, two key pieces of legislation that came forward in the 1960s civil rights victory. But we're less familiar with the Immigration Reform Act. It was the third piece of civil rights legislation. These three pieces of legislation are the cornerstones of civil rights in the United States. What was this Immigration Reform Act? Well, it ended white supremacy in immigration law. You see, before the civil rights movement victories and this policy victory by the civil rights movement, led primarily by Black folks and their Jewish allies, the United States set its immigration and refugee policies based off of the current demographic makeups at that time. Meaning, if 60% of the population came from England, then 60% of the immigration numbers had to be from England. It was these laws that were put in place in the 1920s and 30s as a subtle form of anti-Jewish bigotry. You see, many of these laws were put into place to prevent Jews from fleeing to the United States as they were fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, and later, the growing Holocaust in Europe. You see, even Anne Frank was a victim of these immigration laws. Her family was turned back from immigrating to the United States because of these anti-Jewish laws. The civil rights movement overturned those. And it was in the Jewish community's interest that that happened. They had faced the draconian nature of those laws. They understood what it had done to their community and what it might do to other communities. The civil rights movement was quite victorious. Often, as part of the larger Black Lives Matters umbrella, right? I remember some of my friends wearing shirts saying, "Not my mother's civil rights movement, not my mama's civil rights movement." And I remember teasing my friends, I like that shirt because it actually signifies it's a new moment, it's a new age. But I also like to tease my friends. And I would say to them, you're right, it's not our mother's civil rights movement, because our mother's civil rights movement was really badass. And what I mean by that is that our mother's civil rights movement and our grandparents' civil rights movement, had to struggle at a time where white supremacy was the rule of law. It was the uncontested space. White supremacy was how we understood politics, the economy, culture, religion, you name it, and it is the lens upon which America understood the world. And then along comes this civil rights movement, largely made up of people that this society saw as inferior, Black people. And the society saw Black people as inferior in every way. But this movement defeats white supremacy as the rule of law. Now imagine for a second, you're an arch segregationist. You believe Black people are inferior in every way. You don't spend a lot of time contemplating it. It's how you've been socialized for generations. It's in the air you breathe. It's for you just how the world should be. Black people are inferior, white people are superior. But you wake up one day and you realize your entire world is changed by folks you saw as inferior. How do you make sense of that world? Do you all of a sudden say, well, I guess I must have got that wrong, welcome Black people into full humanity? Well, not likely. Most people do not change their minds that quickly, particularly when you've been socialized so deeply by white supremacy. So they had to come up with a different answer. And they came up with an answer based off of things they had been exposed to. For you see, Black people in their minds were never going to be the people who caused this to happen. So many who had been former veterans of World War II remembered something they had been exposed to when they had been in Europe, a book called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was a fake narrative, a book that had been circulated by Russian secret police because of their fear of democracy in France. The parallel is actually uncanny in this moment. They circulated this book in order to undermine democracy, to recast it as something ominous and evil. The story purported to tell of Jewish elders who gathered in a cemetery at midnight to plot the takeover and destruction of European Christendom. The story claimed falsely that these Jewish elders had plotted the takeover of finance, of cultural institutions, of politics, of economy in order to achieve their ends. This book and its narrative are quite powerful. How powerful? Well, in fact, you probably know, even if you don't know the entire narrative of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, you actually know it unconsciously. You just don't know that it's that narrative. Let me explain. Have you ever heard of the film and the movie The X-Files, right? Made by producer and writer Chris Carter. Very famous TV series that took place in the 1990s and early 2000s. The X-Files were a story of two FBI agents who were on the search for the truth. They believed that there was a secret alien invasion to take over and destroy the world and to infect humanity with an alien virus. And that these aliens had made a deal with the political elite in finance, in arts and culture, in politics, and in industry in order to orchestrate this takeover. And that these FBI agents were the only folks who knew that this conspiracy, this great conspiracy, was at work. And their job was to reveal the truth and to warn humanity. If you understand the plot of the X-Files, you understand the plot line of modern day anti-Semitism. Indeed, anti-Semitism isn't just at the core of white nationalism, it is the core of white nationalism. It is so central to white nationalism that I believe as a racial justice activist that Black people and other marginalized groups will never win equity if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role that they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils and the driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of the modern day movement of white nationalism is the explicit claim that Jews are a separate race. For you see, modern day anti-Semitism does not position Jews as a religious other. Anti-Semitism isn't an anti-religious form of bigotry. It casts Jews as a racial other. And their ostensible position as white, because most Jews are seen as white, for the white nationalist movement is the greatest trick the devil has ever played. Jews, despite and indeed because of the fact that they're seen as white, are placed by white nationalists as an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. It is this fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains for white nationalists how Black Americans, this race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how feminists and the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how workers, particularly immigrant workers, could mount a successful challenge to income inequality. Folks often ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? My response is it's everywhere. It's everywhere you look. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was drawing directly from the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. When we hear rhetoric about white minorities, whites facing genocide, whites losing power, facing extinction in America, they are intimately tapping into familiar language. And it is that rabid anti-Semitism that is the framework of which the entire movement functions. To refuse to deal with any ideology of domination, whether it's racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, or other forms of bigotry, is to abet that ideology. For those of us who are concerned about white nationalism, fighting anti-Semitism cuts off the animating force of white nationalism for the sake of all of our communities. I often share with people that here in the United States, people of color are likely to find themselves more victimized by anti-Semitism than the Jewish community itself. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that over the last 4 years, and indeed over the last 10 years, we have seen a rash of violent hate crimes. From the mass attack on the mass shooting attack on Latinos in a Walmart in El Paso, to the attack of African American worshipers in Charlotte, South Carolina, to the attack on Sikh community in Wisconsin, to the killing and targeting of Jews worshiping in Pittsburgh. Now, while Pittsburgh was driven by anti-Jewish hate, and Charleston, South Carolina was driven by anti-Black racism, and in El Paso, the targets were immigrants and Latinos driven by xenophobia, and Sikhs being targeted in Wisconsin because of anti-Muslim bigotry. Driving underneath those drivers was anti-Semitism. Each of those killers attacked those communities because they believed they were in an existential war against the Jewish community. What I want us to understand is that anti-Semitism impacts all of us. But to fight anti-Semitism effectively means drawing a distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism. For those arch segregationists, anti-Semitism provided the answer to them. You see, it allowed them to hold in place their white superiority. They no longer had to argue that they lost against Black people. As I said, for them, that would have been impossible. Instead, they were able to blame Jews for the victory of the civil rights movement. That was the birth of modern day anti-Semitism as part of the white nationalist movement. If white supremacy is a system of exploitation, white nationalism is that social movement that seeks to engage in ethnic cleansing of Jews and people of color in order to create a white-only ethnic state. Unlike white supremacy, it doesn't seek to take us back to the days of the past, back to the days of Gone with the Wind. Despite the rhetoric of Make America Great Again, the white nationalist movement seeks to overthrow the United States in order to implement its vision of the future. It is a movement that is committed to revolution, not reform. It is not a conservative movement, but a radical revolutionary movement that seeks to do away with liberalism and conservatism altogether. That movement, since the end of the civil rights movement, has worked its way from the margins to the mainstream. Why? Because of our help. We have to understand that conflating white supremacy and white nationalism is an arrogance. What it does is it allows us to simplify the things that outrage us in society, but do nothing to help us counter it. I often argue with people that conflating white supremacy and white nationalism is like conflating a Big Mac and a cow because they are both made out of beef. When we drop our Big Mac on the ground, we do not call a veterinarian. The tools needed to address white supremacy, these systems of discrimination that stay with us, are not the tools we need to address white nationalism, a social movement. We address white supremacy by addressing the systems of inequality, by putting in processes that seek to challenge unconscious bias in our systems. White supremacy is a social movement that needs to be isolated, one in which its base must be competed for, one in which we must understand is not merely a criminal issue, but a social problem. White nationalism is a social movement that has influence on our society. It was part of a coalition that elected Donald Trump to the White House, but it pre-exists. If white supremacy is driven and written upon the paper of race in America, then white nationalism is written on the paper of anti-Semitism. To undo white supremacy, one must understand how racism functions in America. And to undo white nationalism, one must understand how anti-Semitism functions in America. For you see, white nationalists don't bring anti-Semitism into our community. They simply organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. This is why you often hear me refuse to talk about left-wing or right-wing anti-Semitism, or liberal or conservative anti-Semitism, or Black anti-Semitism or white anti-Semitism. None of those things exist except in our mind. There is only anti-Semitism and how different political movements and entities and leaders at time choose to tap into that anti-Semitism. Sometimes tapping into that anti-Semitism is unconscious. such as incidences we have seen at times, where it's done because people simply don't know. They don't understand anti-Semitism. They've never discussed it. And then those are those intentional tapping into anti-Semitism, the David Dukes, the Louis Farrakhan, who seek to stir up anti-Semitism in order to build political power. While how we address each of those forms of anti-Semitism should differ, we don't need to treat people who stumble into it accidentally as if they are David Duke and Louis Farrakhan. Neither can we ignore that anti-Semitism. We have to see it as an opportunity to strengthen all of our muscles. Why is that important? Because anti-Semitism explains much of what we saw play out here in the United States for the last 4 years. And without understanding anti-Semitism, we don't understand how to undo what we are seeing. I'll give one example here as we come to a close. Many people may have heard of QAnon. QAnon is a large conspiracy that's been circulating for about 6 years now, primarily on the internet. It particularly picked up speed after the election of Donald Trump. Many of you may have heard the name QAnon. For about the last 18 months, folks have been asking me, what is QAnon? Explain it. What I know is that if folks understood anti-Semitism and the protocols of the elders of Zion, I wouldn't have to explain what QAnon is. Everyone would recognize it for exactly what it is. Let me tell you the story now that you understand the protocols. The story of QAnon is this, that Donald Trump is actually a superhero, not in special powers, but that because he's waging a secret war against a clandestine global elite that have used finance, have used politics, have used culture, and have used religion in order to target children in America, children in Europe, and children in Australia for sexual assault and sexual exploitation. And that Donald Trump and those who follow him through the QAnon conspiracies are the only ones who understand this conspiracy and are trying to wake the rest of the world up and to save children. Now that you know the protocols, you will understand how closely QAnon parallels the narrative of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. You also understand how it parallels the anti-Semitic trope of blood libel, the idea of Jews targeting children, European children, in order to engage in genocide. Plain and simple, QAnon would not exist without a misunderstanding of America, of how anti-Semitism functions. But it doesn't mean everyone who follows QAnon understands that it's anti-Semitic. Indeed, powerful narratives of bigotry can function in ways where they're no longer attached to the source material. I'll give you a little example. About 25 years ago, it's been that long, I was at a rally in support of Native people who are standing up for their traditional religious rights. And I was there to show solidarity as a civil rights leader and a racial justice activist. And I was there with my mentor and at the time, her very young daughter, who was about 3 or 4. At that rally, all of a sudden, her young daughter started saying, "Mom, Mom," really loud, you know, how kids can do in that most inappropriate time. And her mom was trying to like keep her quiet. But her daughter kept going and tugging on her, "Mom, Mom." So finally, my mentor asked her, you know, what do you want? You know? And her daughter all of a sudden pointed around and said, "Are these Indians?" And her mom said, "Yes, they are." And the next thing her daughter said is, "Indians are bad." Now, my mentor was shocked. That is nothing her daughter would have learned inside of her household. Her mom was a long-time civil rights activist, long-time racial justice activist. She was shocked. So she told her daughter, that's not true. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Later on, we found out where her daughter got that message from. It turned out, like a week or two before, she had been watching cartoons, and she had been watching a cartoon of Popeye. And Popeye had been being chased around by a caricature, a racist caricature and stereotypical caricature of a native person in a headdress and a tomahawk. She had seen that and internalized what that had meant for her. Now imagine that she had never been at that rally. Imagine she had never had the chance to articulate that statement. Imagine that she didn't have a parent who could unpack that and say, well, but so and so, aren't they nice? Yes. Well, they're native, right? If she hadn't been able to unpack that, her young daughter could have long forgotten about the cartoon, but remembered the feelings and the anxiety, setting up in her an unconscious bias towards Native people. In the same way, in our society, anti-Semitism is not merely a set of behaviors. It is also an unconscious bias and a systemic bias. Now, I'm not here to say that it functions in the same way or manner as anti-Black racism. I'm not here to put it on a hierarchy of oppression, but neither am I here to say that Jews face more physical danger. What I'm merely pointing out is that anti-Semitism does exist, and it functions in a different manner than other forms of racism. The role of anti-Semitism isn't just to exploit the Jewish community in the way that racism exploits Blacks or immigrants. The role of anti-Semitism is to exploit Jews as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in American society, so that the have-nots have an escape valve, a place where they can place their frustrations without being heavily penalized by larger society. It keeps the haves safe from the have-nots. Jews have been exploited in this way in the United States for quite some time. It is one of the ways that anti-Semitism plays out. But I believe anti-Semitism plays out in other ways as well, ways that are new to us, because like all forms of racism, anti-Semitism evolves. Imagine for a second that we only understood anti-Black racism through the lens of 1920s racism in America, the wave of lynchings that took place across this country. What if that were our only standard upon which we judge the severity of anti-Black racism? How much we will have limited ourselves if we were to do that. Nothing would ever rise to that standard in this moment. The huge waves of hundreds, if not thousands, of Black people who were lynched and beaten to death during that period. But we know that racism works on a continuum. And in the same way, neither can we limit our understanding of the impact of anti-Semitism by merely viewing it through the lens of 1920 through 1940. It's insufficient. And like racism, anti-Semitism has also evolved in ways that we must comprehend. Let's be clear. This white nationalist movement and its alt-right coalition is leading a fight in what they believe to be an existential war against the Jews. Now, they might be savvy enough to no longer talk about the international Jewish banking conspiracy and merely just frame it as the international banking conspiracy. They may be smart enough not to say the Jew and instead say the political elite or Hollywood or fake news. But we must come to understand these dog whistle politics in the same way that we understand when someone says thug, when someone says welfare queen. We know exactly what that means, and we understand what the implications are. Anti-Semitism needs to be explored and debated in the United States, but that doesn't happen until we open up space for it, Jews and non-Jews. That means not being so quick, right, to punish and penalize those who don't get it right. It means being more clear about who is intentionally tapping into anti-Semitism and who is merely stumbling around. For you see, without those debates, none of us builds the necessary muscles. Without those arguments, none of us builds the strength to understand anti-Semitism. Indeed, our weakness on anti-Semitism is what has put democracy at risk. Anti-Semitism provides the counterpoint to democracy. Instead of systems that are managed by people with agency and legitimate grievances, anti-Semitism repositions our society to say that people of color have no real legitimacy, no real credibility, no legitimate grievances. They have no real agency, that they are merely puppets on the strings of their Jewish puppet masters. Anti-Semitism denies myself as a non-Jewish Black person my legitimate grievances in this society. Anti-Semitism proffers that none of us get to make a decision, that society is just controlled in ways we have no access to. It increases social alienation. So we must take on anti-Semitism for all of our sakes. All of us have skin in the game. Without taking on anti-Semitism, as I said before, we'll be unable to tackle the large issue of white nationalism in this society. Its political influence, its violence, and its cultural impact. Left unchecked, white nationalism will put our society at great risk, greater than we've already witnessed. We cannot ignore this and make the same mistake that we have made for decades. For you see, to discount the impact of that social movement is to discount the impact of our own social movements. None of us would sit here today and say that the civil rights movement had no impact on our society. Life today in America, in 2020 America, is better than it was for Black people in 1920 America. And I can guarantee you, much better than it was in 1820 America. The arc continues to bend for justice, particularly when those movements led by Black people continue to advance in our society. Today, more white Americans, by percentage, right, are supportive of Black Lives Matter than were ever supportive of Martin Luther King Jr. in his lifetime. Today, more white Americans oppose racism than supported the student nonviolent coordinating committees in the 1960s. We are moving the constituencies that white nationalists seek to recruit. But we need to manage this white nationalist backlash to the civil rights movement. We do so again by tackling the twin specters of white supremacy and white nationalism. I'll finish with this story. I remember once, about 3 or 4 years ago, that there was an alt-right demonstration here in Portland, Oregon. And there was an alt-right activist, might have been a white nationalist, might have just been part of the larger coalition of the alt-right that's driven by this white nationalist movement. And he was like sitting down, and there was this guy with a camera who was just haranguing this young white nationalist. And he was shouting at him like, why are you here? Why are you here in Portland? No one wants you in Portland. The mayor doesn't want you in Portland. These protesters don't want you in Portland. No one wants you in Portland. He, on and on. And this young alt-right activist said something that all of us should hear. He said to the guy holding the camera, yeah, I've heard we're not wanted. But the truth is that you all are doing something in Portland we could never get away with. And he went on to say, in Portland, the Black population is shrinking by whole number and percentage, and that it's one of the few cities in America where that's happening. He went on to say, you can say you don't want us, but you're actually disappearing Black America, Black Portland, and we could never do that. In short, he was calling us hypocrites. He was saying that we don't have a real vision for what our society should be. We've become lazy and have decided that the status quo is good enough. But I'm here to tell you, the status quo is not nearly good enough. As I said before, we are dealing with a pandemic. We are dealing with economic instability. We are dealing with social alienation that allows the white nationalist movement to recruit. We have to address these issues, not just to compete for white constituencies, but for those communities on the front lines who have carried that burden for generations now. It is time for us to move from one age to another. It is time to let go of this status quo and to move forward into an inclusive democracy that is grounded in the ability of people to live, love, worship, and work free from fear. A society that meets the needs of all of its residents. A society that understands that we do not have to live in models of scarcity. We are a society of abundance. We are a society of creativity that understands how to align around problems in our society and forge solutions. We may not have always been that society, but it is the society that we are now. And it's time for us to move. And it's time for us to move together. That means putting anti-Semitism up on the table for discussion. It means asking and demanding civil and human rights organizations to open up the space for conversation around anti-Semitism, not to distract, right, to the racism that communities of color experience, but to add to the richness of our solution. By adding anti-Semitism into the list of discussion, it opens up the space for us to forge new coalitions. If we don't do it for that, let's do it for another reason. About 4 or 5 months ago, I saw a video, and it was taking place in the rallies in Minnesota after the murder and killing of George Floyd. Think about the murder. I won't even call it a murder because it was actually legal somehow in our country. But in the killing of George Floyd, you think about the rise of the civil rights movement, the largest demonstrations that have ever been witnessed in this country. You think about the level of energy. But what I think about is the daughter of George Floyd. I saw her on the shoulders of a family friend in the midst of the march. Tens of thousands of people on the streets in Minneapolis. And I thought about this young girl. She never gets her father back. Her father never gets to teach her how to play ball or to teach her how to dance, to give her away to her partner if she decides to get married, and to celebrate her graduation day. She never has her daughter, or she never has her father teach her how to drive. This young girl never gets her father back. And there she was in this crowd, this young girl, the shoulders of a family member, looking at all of these thousands of people. And she was looking, just staring around. And all of a sudden I heard her say something. I heard her say, "My daddy changed the world." She's right. Her daddy did change the world. And that young girl deserves that world. We owe her that world. But she doesn't get that world unless we step up right now. She doesn't get that world unless we choose to stand. This is the moment where each of us gets to choose to be human. This is the moment where we get to shine our light for the generation that came before us, who sacrificed so much to get us here, and to shine the way for the generation that comes after us. We don't do that by getting in the way. We do it by helping all of us to get to the top of the promised land, the top of the mountain. That's where we stand right now. It's not just about the political violence that we will experience over this period. I wish I could give you an easy answer on how that goes away, but I can't. That is now out of the bottle, and it will be with us for some time. But if we stand now, we can shorten the duration of that political violence. We can limit its impact. We do so by coming together. We do it for the daughter of George Floyd. We do it for ourselves. Can we do it? How do we do it? Well, I'll leave you with this. When I was a young kid, we would play this game in the summer called If I Were. And we play it because summer was long, didn't have a lot of money. By the time August came around, right, we kids had nothing to do but wait until school started. So usually we'd find ourselves playing this game on the hot sidewalk, sitting in a circle. And someone would say, if I were in a lion's cage and somehow the lion got into the cage, here's what I would do. And we'd argue about what we would do and how we get out of that predicament. The question that would always come up every summer was, if I were in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, here is what I would do. Now, we didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents. We didn't understand what it meant to live under Jim Crow. So we were full of bravado about what we would or wouldn't put up with, what we would respond with and what we wouldn't. We were just kids. That question has always haunted me. What would I have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement? And that question may haunt some of you, and some of you actually may have been there. Well, I'm here to tell you, about 6 years ago, I realized I no longer had to wonder what I would do. And I'm here to tell you all today, neither do you. The truth is, whatever it is you would have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement is what you will do when you walk out of this virtual meeting today. Make it count. History will judge you. It is time to advance an inclusive democracy, meaning people-centered, accountable, and transparent. We need not be ashamed of that call. Those who came before us laid down their lives to bring about democracy. John Lewis, who recently passed, said that the 1960 civil rights movement took the idea of democracy from an aspiration to a reality. Now it's time for us to make good on that reality. We do so by leaning in together. We do so by understanding that we have to advance Black liberation in this country. And when I say Black liberation, what I mean is making democracy real. It is those Black people who brought democracy to America, joined by women, immigrants, the LGBTQ community, indigenous communities, and others, workers. Here we are on the mountaintop. We are looking down into the valley of inclusive democracy. We merely have to have the courage to move forward. That is the task before us. And with that, I encourage you to take that step. And I welcome you to the 21st century civil rights movement. Thank you.
So I really have to say thank you. And one of the issues, of course, that we have in this virtual space is that if we were all together, I am positive you would be hearing a lot of applause right now, as we are seeing, because that really was an amazing and wonderful presentation. And thank you so much for coming and giving us that. We have a few minutes for questions, and Mrs. Ellen Simpson will read us some questions.
All right. So, what do you see as things that we can do to combat the white nationalists and eliminate this strain of political action from the United States?
Yeah. The first thing you can do, what everyone can do, is you need to call every elected official who represents you. I don't care if that's a school board member, right, to the incoming president of the United States, and you need to be very clear with them about what values you expect them to hold. And you need to give them a really clear message. Their job is to defend democracy, not sedition. Let elected officials know. That's the very first thing you can do. And you can do that by email, you can do that by text, you can do that by phone. I encourage everyone to do that. Every day, call one elected official, tell them you're concerned about white nationalism, and ask them what they are doing to support communities to effectively inoculate themselves from white nationalism. So that's the first thing. The second piece, if we think about that alt-right young person, right, we need to tackle segregation in our communities. Segregation in employment, segregation in housing, segregation in education, right? Segregation, in transportation. These four areas provide kind of the fodder, right, for this white nationalist movement. Segregation prevents us from building racial intimacy. And study after study has shown that racial intimacy, right, coming together, being exposed to one another over and over, is the only effective antidote to demographic anxiety. This fear of the other that is actually quite natural, but that white nationalists are telling folks is an existential threat, not a natural process of demographic change. The third is this: you have to be an organization. You have to either be part of your local social action committee, you have to join RAC, right, the Religious Action Committee, you have to be active in your real estate association, right, or in your quilting group or your gardening group. You have to be in some form of organization. You cannot take this on your own. And so you have to be in that organization. And as an organization, you have to ask yourself, what is one thing we can do? It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be the March on Washington. It could simply be dropping off meals, right, to folks over 65, some who have not actually seen another living human being in over a year, almost in nearly a year, right, in this pandemic. It could be standing aside folks who are Black Lives Matters activists. It can be anything. Please don't try to make it the most significant thing in the world. What I tell folks is to do one thing. So again, call your elected official. 2, fight segregation in policies and practices. And 3, join an organization today.
Okay, if I have another minute.
Oh, actually, hold on one second.
Not through what?
Oh, I just want to, since it is 12:30, I just want to ask first if it's okay if we go over 10 minutes. If you can't, it's okay. But I do want to make sure that we get to some of the other questions. If everyone's okay, if you can't, no problem. And thank you so much for attending.
Yes, and everybody has given such thumbs ups for this.
Mm-hmm.
This was a question that came to me via a text from somebody rather than through the chat. It said, it seems that the Jewish and the Black communities are estranged from one another. And what can we do to keep our communities together?
So there is tension. It's a good question on whether the communities are really that estranged from, like, if there's a new estrangement. I actually think the relationship is probably hasn't changed that significantly. It's fascinating to think. There's lots of myths about the Black-Jewish relationship in the midst of the civil rights movement, right? There's a myth that, Jewish institutions stepped up and, were there. Well, that's not true. There were Jewish leaders, right? And there were young Jewish activists who really did respond, right, in really powerful ways, disproportionately. And I would argue today, right, that one of the unintended outcomes of identifying Jews as white all the time is you actually don't get to see the large, significant number of Jewish activists who are involved in social change issues today, right? So they're made invisible, right? Or the other white. So the tensions, I think, are this. Here are the tensions. The tensions are around the fact, right, for a very brief amount of time in America, it appeared that Jews were assimilating, right, into whiteness. Now, I also argue in the way that anti-Semitism works as a system, Jews often find themselves most a target at the point where they feel most assimilated, right? That's what has happened in Europe. That appears to be what's happening here in the United States. I believe that's the case because the way that anti-Semitism works, one of the tropes, right, is of the nefarious Jew who is secretly trying to infiltrate society. Assimilation plays into that trope, creating a backlash. Now, the estrangement or the tension between the Black and Jewish community has to do with the segregation of Jewish communities, right? Pre-1960s America, where Jews also faced redlining and were also largely an immigrant community. Immigrant communities traditionally are placed where when they come to the United States? Well, adjacent to Black communities. Much of the tension between Black and Jewish communities in the North are no different than the tensions between Black and Korean, right? Relationships you saw in Los Angeles, or Black and South Asian relationships you might see in places like Seattle, or Black and Arab relationships you might see in Brooklyn. But the way that anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism play in our society, it seeks to kind of highlight this tension, to try to argue it's much more than it is, because it lets the rest of society off the hook. See, Jews and Black people can't get along, so why are you making us try to do things? So the way that I would reframe it is the tension you see between Black and Jewish communities is actually proof that anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness work in the ways that they are actually intended, right? When you see a growth of anti-Semitism in the have-nots, it means that anti-Semitism as a system is functioning in the way that it designed. When you see Jews, right, participating in anti-Blackness, right, holding, for instance, Black folks who make anti-Semitic accusations, right, in a more harsh way than they would white counterparts, that is anti-Blackness. The lesson to take away from that is that the tensions are not as great as they seem, right? But that being the victim of one form of bigotry doesn't prevent us from acting out on another. And that is what is happening within Black and Jewish communities. And it's why we have to find ways to begin to lean in to one another. And leaning in means being quite intentional. It will not happen naturally. There's no rule book on what that's supposed to look like. So we have to just start practicing. And luckily for all of us, young Jews of color, particularly young Black Jews, right? And also younger activists in the Black community have really tried to struggle with one another on how to do that. And they may not be doing it in the ways that we would do it, or even in the ways that, are perfect to us, but we should be supporting that. They are bridges. It's not their job or responsibility to be those bridges, but it is the bridge that they are serving right now. And we should support them if they have to be bridges. We need to support them to be the strongest bridges that they can be in this moment.
Thank
They
you.
really are carrying a lot for both communities right now, a lot.
A question just came through. Well, two quickies. One says, in your experience, what is the best way, I'm saying, is there one, to get someone who is thoroughly brainwashed with white nationalism rhetoric to listen to any other argument?
Yeah. Well, not by arguing with them. So I can tell you the things not to do. Look, that influence rides on a spectrum, right? So we have to remember, right? It doesn't come out of thin air. So, you are dealing with folks who are hardcore white nationalists to folks who are just influenced by white nationalism and many of these conspiracy theories. The first thing that I say is anywhere along the spectrum, do not argue, right? When you argue with folks, numerous studies have shown, when you argue with folks who hold a different worldview, right? You're not arguing policy, right? You're not arguing whether you should eat a burger or a hot dog. You are arguing fundamental existential ways that people see the world. When you argue, folks will perceive you are attacking their worldview, right? The way that they understand the world. That immediately puts someone in a defensive posture. That means they will only respond in ways of defense, not reflection and thought. It also means the more you argue with them, the more you point out the contradictions in their thinking, the more you're actually teaching them how to fortify their arguments better, right? There was a study that was shown of anti-bias trainings that showed anti-bias trainings work best for folks who are already open to it. Folks who are closed to it actually become more hardened in their bigotry because you've now given them arguments, right? They're sitting there the whole time coming up with counter arguments. So stop arguing with folks. If you are truly interested in pulling someone out, right? First, you have to tell yourself consciously that you are committing to a very long process, possibly a process of years. Second, if you choose to do that, you don't get to choose to remove yourself halfway through the process unless there is some kind of physical harm. You have to commit, right, to that process. Three, it means you are going to do a lot more listening than you are talking. You're going to be saying a lot more questions, right, than pronouncements. Because at the end of the day, if you want to pull someone from that movement, you want to help them get out, right? You have to be their best friend in thick or thin. What I mean is, you have to be with them until that point where they are indicating they are going to engage in violence, or you understand that they have engaged in violence, right? And you become their anchor to the real world. And there is a point where they will understand, right, that the movement they are in is bankrupt. There is a point where they will understand that the civil rights movement in this country has delivered more for white America than the white nationalist movement ever has or ever will. But if you aren't anchored in that moment, if they don't know that they can reach out to you, right, without embarrassment, but just for help to get out, they will never leave that movement. So it's a real commitment to pull folks out. I want to give an alternative. I'm not telling folks not to do that. But most folks aren't up for that kind of talk. So I want to share something else. Instead of focusing on the most hardened white nationalists, we should focus on the folks that they're trying to recruit, right? The folks who they want to be part of their constituency. And we don't do that well, right? Unless we help those folks imagine what the actual multiracial democracy that is America looks like today. It means we have to show them the future. And if the future we show them is one of call out culture and hierarchies of oppression and arrogance because people don't have the right language or don't ask the questions in the right way or carry some of the old tropes and stereotypes of the past. If that's all we are giving them is the alternative to white nationalism, I can tell you right now, we're going to lose, right? We have to show everyone that they have a place in inclusive democracy and in the future of inclusive democracy. We have to show that we can deliver tangible things, community, safety, and prosperity, that it's an abundant future. And that means at the end of the day, policy change.
Wow.
Yes.
We will end on that, I think.
Yes, yes. So again, I very much want to thank our speaker, Eric Ward, for coming and joining us this morning and into our afternoon. And thank everybody for coming here. Just a couple of announcements. If you want to continue engaging in this work, at least as a member of Congregation Eitz Chaim, we have two organizing organizations that work in this, DuPage United and of course, Religious Action Center of Illinois. If you want to continue our discussion from Eitz Chaim, we're having our anti-racist discussion at 4 o'clock today that you are more than welcome to attend. And if you're not part of Eitz Chaim, look into your own institutions if you haven't already to see that. I'm sure there's a program like that as well. And if not, as we heard the call, go and start one, and we can work together. And as we heard earlier, that was so wonderful to continue to bend the arc of history towards justice. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. If you'd like to view this, it will be on our YouTube page. But the best thing to do is also to contact Eric Ward yourself and have him come and speak at your own institution as well, because this was really wonderful. And thank you so much again for being here today. Bye-bye. Do you want to, Karen and Mary and Marla?
Awesome.
Yes, that was really wonderful.
Yeah, that was great.
Till the end, there were 155 people that stayed on. People
Wow.
stayed on through the whole thing. There were 100 and I think it was 96 at the most.
I saw 198. So it was because I was watching it closely because I really wanted to get to that 200. I was going to take a picture of it, but it's okay. 198 is great too.
Yeah.
Because I also know a few people were watching it as families together, so we were still over 200.
Definitely over 200, and yeah, it was.
Oh, Marina came. Oh, hey.
Oh yeah, look at that. So is that list of participants going to stay somehow? We can access it?
I'm pretty sure. Let me go and check. If not, I did. Okay.
I took pictures of all the screens. I went through it and took pictures.
Oh, thank you.
So
It's still here right now, at least.
all the people that were there, yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
The names.
Yeah.
Great.
Well,
Oh, super.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, that was great and really well attended. Good.
Lots in the
Wow.
chat right now too.
He is quite a speaker.
Oh, you know what? We're still live streaming. I'll end that.